Greetings. My name is Jalandra A. Davis, otherwise known as Mommy Melusine. I am a writer, scholar, educator, dancer, mermaid enthusiast, and all around creative. Welcome to the Merwomanist podcast, where we talk about Black mermaid lore, fantasy, spirituality, and aquatic culture. Dive in and enjoy. Greetings and welcome back to the Merwomanist podcast with Mommy Melusine. And I am here today with an episode that I believe is going to include both the conclusion to my Black Mermaid novel wrap up with a review of Gabi Burton's Drown Me with Dreams, which is the sequel to Sing Me to Sleep in the Sing Me to Sleep duology that I started a few weeks ago. And I also think, because I don't know if I have a whole lot to say about the book. So let's get started. First, I just want to talk a little bit about what's been going on the last few weeks. I'm really disappointed that I didn't get this episode out and finish that Black Mermaid wrap up sooner. I actually read the book 3 weeks ago and was planning to record an episode, but I had to get out of town for a wedding and I just was not able to make it happen. And since I've got back, it's just been thing after thing. I hate to say life has been lifing because truthfully, it always is. I am a parent of a child with Down syndrome. I've been leaning really heavily into parenting lately. The first couple of years of my job on the tenure track, I really prioritized career. I took care of my son. I kept him clothed, happy, fed, going to school, going to therapies. But I was definitely in an era of prioritizing career and maybe not spending as much time actively working on moving him forward in a lot of the goals that we have for him, being involved in school, that sort of thing. I just really have taken the opportunity of having a very flexible work situation right now to just really be a mom. I'm always a mom, but just being more active and engaged with moving some things forward that I want to happen. One of the aspects of having a child with Down syndrome that kind of sometimes makes me envious of my parents that have typically developing children is I think that people often say things like, "Oh, well, the kid will learn that eventually. They'll pick that up eventually." I had a friend whose daughter potty trained herself, and she said, "Yeah, eventually they just wanna go to the toilet." I just think that people whose children grow in a neurotypical way, sort of developmentally typical way, kind of take for granted how there are things that just kind of happen as children grow older and that their independence just develops as they grow older. So I will often hear academic parents say things like, oh, when your children are really small, things are going to be really hard, but when they get more independent, it's going to get easier. And I think that just takes for granted the idea that your children will get that greater independence without you having to really, really work very, very hard to achieve that. And so that is something that I'm trying to do right now is just work really, really hard to try to advance my son forward on some of our goals around speech and taking care of himself so that he can develop that independence. But it's not something that's just going to happen naturally. It's something that takes therapy hours and strategies and lots of meetings with families and medical teams and therapy teams and school teams. And, I just think it's something that people who this isn't their journey really, really take for granted. you know, it's not just going to happen without me working really hard for it. So that's just been where my focus has been. Also, when we were on our trip that we took recently, I had an accident when I was helping my son get into the car at one point. I still don't know exactly what I did, but whatever I did, I slipped. I don't know. I don't remember exactly what happened, but whatever I did ripped half of my nail from my nail bed. I've got this sort of makeshift waterproof cover right now. If you're watching the video episode of this over my past situation, I actually had to go to several doctor's appointments about this. I had to have a procedure with a plastic surgeon to try to correct the nail, and it looks like I have a 50% chance of getting my pinky nail back. So I've been in some grief about that because I love getting my nails done. My nails were really pretty right now. The one that isn't ripped off for my nail bed. So yeah, I really actually I've been in grief about my pinky nail. I really have. Every time I sit down to record, because I talk with my hands a lot, I see it and pray for my pinky nail. Pray for my pinky nail. Okay, let's get into this episode. I'm going to talk about Drown Me with Dreams by Gabi Burton. This is the sequel to Sing Me to Sleep. So I do recommend going back and listening to part 2 of my Black Mermaid novel wrap-up series and listening to my review of Sing Me to Sleep because I don't want to do a whole lot of plot recap. It's a sequel, so going to be kind of hard to talk about it without spoiling some aspects of the first book, but I'm going to do my best. So this series is about a siren named Circe who lives in a fictional kingdom named Kirdra, where the ruling class of the kingdom and only Fae have full rights, full citizenship, or at the height of the hierarchy in this kingdom. Other kinds of creatures are either subordinated in the hierarchy or they're persecuted or they're not allowed to exist at all. So humans, so like witches do get to be a part of the hierarchy, but they can't get to maybe the highest levels, and there are a lot of control and surveillance on the way that they perform their magic. Humans do exist in the kingdom of Kirdra, but only as servants. They are the lowest rung of the hierarchy. It's basically an apartheid system. They are not admitted to schools. They work as servants. They are kind of non-person. But sirens, right? Her lore of a siren is similar to what we've heard before. They can control people with their beauty, with their song. They have the power to manipulate water. They are not allowed to exist at all. Sirens are not supposed to exist. There was actually a massacre of sirens, and Circe seems to be the last living siren in this world. So the first book was kind of a sort of a enemies to loverish, not that much, truthfully. Like Circe falls for Hayes pretty quickly, but it's kind of a enemy to loverish kind of romanticy setup where Circe becomes the bodyguard, one of the bodyguards for the Prince Hayes of this kingdom. She is hiding her identity as a siren. She is hiding her face with the use of a technology called kill beads that people can use to change their appearance, at least their facial appearance. And but Hayes really he's a good guy. Like he doesn't really believe in upholding this hierarchy in the kingdom. Yes, he's spoiled, yes, he's sheltered, but he wants to do the right thing. So I can't really get into the first book without saying that the second book without saying that the first book does end with Hayes being able to assume power as king and trying to make some changes in Kirdra. So, something else that happens in the first book is that Circe is betrayed by somebody that she cares about and trusts. A very deep, I would say unforgivable betrayal. And another important element of this world building is that Kirida is separated from the rest of the world by a magical barrier. And on the other side of barrier live some of the creatures that were banished from Kirdra. One of the plot lines in the first book was that there is a resistance movement within Kirdra trying to bring down the barrier and invade Kirdra in order to overturn Hayes family's rule. And it turns out, well, yeah, I think I can say that without getting too much into all of the details of the first book if you still want to read it. So at the beginning of the second book, it picks up like a week where the first book left off. Hayes is sending Circe across the barrier in order to investigate what's going on the other side. Does this army that the resistance believed was on the other side of the barrier actually exist? Are they actually preparing to invade Kirdra? You know, what's going on there, right? But he sends her across the barrier along with the person who betrayed her in the first book. So she has to go across the barrier with this person that she now really hates. So they're basically kind of giving us a little bit of a redo of the kind of enemies to lover setup. I mean, this is not a romantic relationship, even though there's moments where I started to wonder, but it's at least an enemies to friends setup, right? Or maybe a redemption sort of reconciliation kind of plot that introduces some new tensions and character conflicts because she has to deal with this person while she is doing this whole investigation. So she becomes kind of a double agent because Kurdra also had an army on the other side of the barrier that is trying to take over the kingdom over there. And there is also this resistance movement that wants to invade Kurdra. So she basically becomes kind of a double agent for both of these movements, just trying to find out what's going on. She, while she does want to change things in Kyrgyz, she does believe that Hayes is a good king and that he should be given an opportunity. So she wants to prevent an invasion of Kyrgyz. But at the same time, she is somewhat like affiliated with the resistance in this other kingdom. So this is the setup. What are the things that I liked about this sequel? I like the political complexity of this book. I mean, it's still, this is not Game of Thrones, right? It's still not super complex, but I do like that it's a little bit more political complexity than I have seen in other fantasies where there is a toppling of like an authoritarian government. Often things just kind of, once you get a good king or a good queen, it kind of just becomes a utopia. And that's not what happens here. It really does show that you can't just change the ruler or the ruling class. You also have to change the culture. Even though Hayes, who has different priorities, assumes power, he can't necessarily just at the snap of a finger change everything, right? People are accustomed to these hierarchies, right? They still believe in it. They're the enforcers, which is the class of people who I guess are like the military power in Kurdra. They still have wealth and lands and, you know, people that are loyal to them. They still control these different factions of the military. So from the beginning, he is just beset with it. Right, Hayes is kind of giving Obama, right? Having this government that is pushing against you, right? Like Mitch McConnell said that his number one goal was for Obama to be a first term president. And I was like, oh, wow. Your number one goal wasn't to like serve your constituents, pass legislation, right? It was just to like destroy this man's presidency. That's kind of what Hayes is. That's the kind of energy he's dealing with, right? People standing up in his speeches talking about you lie. That's the energy that Hayes is facing. So I do like the complexity of that. And I like the complexity of just these different factions and everyone has different goals. And Fierce's kind of going back and forth between both sides. I think it was a level of political complexity that's a little bit more than I expect from YA fantasy, at least from some of the books I've been reading recently. I like that the romance achieved more depth and richness, I think, from the first book, where I just didn't think the romance was that compelling. I do think it gets better. It gets a lot better. It's a little hotter. There were a few moments where I'm like, are we getting spicy? You know, maybe this book, I really need to look at the marketing and see if this duology is really considered YA. To me, it feels very YA and the characters are very young. And I don't really see why. I really do actually feel like the characters, like Circe and Hayes, should have been older for what they're doing and what they're engaged in. For kind of a historical, ancient medieval setting, I guess they're not too young for what they're doing, but the book is very much written to a contemporary audience. One of my problems with the language is that it just feels super contemporary, so I kind of feel like these characters could have been older for the kinds of activities that they're engaged in. Fiersa is seducing men all over the place. Hayes is ruling a kingdom. I feel like they could have been older. So I really do feel like the only reason they're teenagers is so this could be marketed as YA. There are times when, especially in this second book, where some of the maturity level is starting to just, it just feels like with some tweaks, I feel like this could have been an adult fantasy. And I wonder how much the popularity of YA fantasy and the marketability of YA fantasy and the promise of potential adaptation of YA fantasy is playing a role in people publishing and writing these works as YA rather than as adult fantasy. That's just kind of a side thought. And there's nothing like spicy in the book. It just seems like if it wasn't YA, it would have been spicy, right? So we get a little bit more chemistry, but we also get more tension. And that was good. I think it was very good to have tension between your major characters, to have them have conflict, to have them have conflicting goals sometimes, and figuring out how to reconcile that. I thought the pacing was pretty good. As I have been reading a lot of YA, and as I have been reading more specifically fantasy and newer releases, one of the critiques that I've had and critiques that I've had seen a lot of people have engaging in kind of the reviewer community is pacing. It just feels like a lot of these books are kind of a slog for the first half, sometimes even the first three fourths, and then it just like speeds up. I didn't feel that about this one. I felt like it was paced pretty well. I felt like things were happening. I didn't feel bored. Sometimes I felt disconnected, which is going to get to when I talk about my things I didn't like, but I never felt like bored by it. I think it moved forward very quickly, very steadily, similarly to the first book. I like that there were some moments about the first book where I felt like some of the magic systems and world building were a little inconsistent, like how her siren power works, how her power to control people works, how the power with the water works, just different aspects that I thought were not consistent. And it's almost as if, and I don't know offhand, like, the years of the releases of these books, but it almost feels like she got notes, like Gabi Burton got notes from the first one about that sort of thing because they're directly addressed in this one. One of the reasons why her siren power doesn't work on everyone, because there are moments in the first book where I'm like, "Why didn't you just use the siren power right there?" Is that the person has to be attracted to her. The person has to be attracted to her for the power to work. So I'm like, "Oh, okay." Now she tells Hayes that, and let me try to save the things that I don't like. But I do like that the magic systems, use of the magic, some of those questions were answered. What are some things that I didn't like? The world just still doesn't feel fleshed out to me. It just, even with the world being expanded, like beyond the barrier into these other lands, other creatures, that was a really exciting possibility. And at first, when she crosses the barrier, it's really fun. Like I think it was the druids. I'm gonna call them the druids for now. But there are these creatures that are kind of like part tree, and when the first interaction with this, I'm like, "Oh my goodness, this is so cool." I've heard of nymphs and spirits that kind of have this kind of hybrid tree thing going on in lore, but I haven't really seen it represented in a book, in like a novel. And I thought that was really exciting, and then that was kinda it. Every time you see the dryads, they're called dryads, okay? Not druids. Druid is a ancient European indigenous religion that maybe at some point I'll talk about on the podcast. Dryads, they're called dryads. So there's these sort of nymph-like creatures that are part tree. They often have green hair, and I thought that that was exciting. Then we learned nothing else about them. Nothing else about them. How does your life work when you're a part tree? We learn nothing else about them except that they have leaves. It's just no sense of their culture. What do they eat? Where do they live? We see at some point that there's a dryad married to a human, which Circe finds really fascinating because I'm just going to call them interracial relationships are not permitted in Kildra, but that's it. That's it. They're just there to be there. And that's the problem I have with that is the problem that I find myself talking about over and over again with some of these books is that I feel like writers, they're writing from the outside in. They're writing from, "Oh, wouldn't this look cool? Wouldn't this moment be cool? Let me like paint the physical image of it," but then they're not going any deeper. And that was very frustrating to me. And I actually don't remember. I know there's other creatures, there's giants. I don't know. I don't really remember other ones. I just feel like the setup for this second book as a chance to see the world beyond Kirdra and see all these creatures that were banished from Kirdra. I feel like that setup wasn't paid off as much as it could be. I felt like that could have been a really exciting opportunity to introduce a lot of fresh characters and dynamics from what these creatures in their lives are like and what their communities are like and how people all engage with each other in this world. And I just feel like we didn't get that. I was also disappointed that Circe does not locate. This is, I'm sorry, spoiler alert. She don't meet no more sirens. I have to talk about this. I'm sorry to spoil that, but I have to talk about this because it's just such a big part of my frustration with the book. Because as far as I know, this is a duology without another book coming. I could be wrong about that. Maybe she will do another book, but everything is wrapped up pretty well. So I don't know. I've only seen this referred to as a duology and not a series. And I don't know what Gabby Burton's plans are. But if we are never going to meet any other sirens, if we're never going to find out where Saoirse comes from, because she's adopted by her family. They kinda just find her and don't realize she's a siren till she gets older. Somebody had to create her. She has to come from somewhere. Where is that? I think that if we never get answers to those questions, that's just super disappointing. So maybe there will be another book. I don't know. I don't know what the plans are. I will keep my eye out for news of another book. So yeah, I just don't think the possibilities that that could have gotten into in terms of these creatures, or I just don't think it was fulfilled. There is too much telling, not showing. So, on the one hand, you have some beautiful scenes and too much showing in terms of we are shown these interesting creatures, but then we don't get anything else. On the other hand, sometimes you just have some blatant telling. So, one of the connections of this to the thing I did, even though I did like the fact that some of my questions about the inconsistency of the magic were answered in this book, I didn't like the way they were answered. Right? Hayes asked Saoirse several questions about how her siren power works, and she tells him. So he says, he asks her something about, oh, why didn't it work here? Or why can't you just use your power? And she says, it only works to people who are attracted to me. And I just think there could have been a way to show that. I think that one of the people who she wasn't able to use the power on could have been like, "Sorry, I don't like you like that." Like, I just and we do primarily see Saoirse using her power on men almost all the time, a little heteronormative. I think there are some cases of of the power working on women, but we primarily see her using the power on men. So I just think if this is how the power works, I think there were missed opportunities. I think there are missed opportunities for some queer moments involving Saoirse and her interaction with women, rather than the queerness being entirely placed onto a side character, which is a very common strategy in contemporary releases. Like there's like a side character who has a wife or they're queer, right? But we don't explore that possibility with the protagonist, even when it seems like it's right there. And I just feel like there was someone could just been like, "Sorry, Siren, I'm not hot for you." Since these books engage in contemporary language anyway. I don't know. Another incidence of too much telling, not showing, is in Circe's flaws, in her character flaws. There was a similar moment. There was a moment in the first book where Circe comes to the realization that she's kind of been using her younger sister and her need to protect her younger sister as a justification for things that she's engaging in her life that she doesn't necessarily have to, right? But she was an assassin in order to make money to help protect. And she was telling herself that she was doing that purely for her sister. And there's a point at which she comes to the realization that no, a lot of what I'm doing for myself. I'm doing the assassin thing because I like to kill, right? And I appreciated that character complexity and that moral grayness and that she's a flawed protagonist. But I kind of wish we had gotten that. Well, I think we kinda did, but there was definitely a moment where she does this whole speech to herself where she's like, "Oh, I've been using my sister for this, but it's not. I've been using," and it's just very it's a little lazy. I just think, "Show it, show it, show it, show it." And so there is a similar moment like that in the second book where Saoirse's having a lot of issues with her relationship to Hayes, and one of the other characters tells her, "You're treating him like a mark," right? So she's treating him like one of her victims, like one of her assassin marks, or one of the people that she uses her siren power to manipulate to get the things she wants, to get access to places, to accomplish her missions. And so someone tells her, "You're treating him like a mark," because she's withholding information from him. She's manipulating him rather than being transparent and being honest. And so she's like, "Wow, I have been treating him like a mark." She just comes to this realization. And I wish that that had felt a little bit more obvious before we're told that directly out of the mouths of these characters. I don't know that that was something that was jumping out to me until it was said, right? And I just think that the book could have done a lot more to explore what real relationships look like for a person who's able to wield this kind of power. And if this power is solely connected to attraction, specifically what romantic relationships look like. So, how do you have a genuine romantic relationship if you have the ability to manipulate your partner to do anything they want? I mean, I've been married for 11 years. If I could make my husband just do whatever I wanted at all times, say whatever I wanted, I would use that. I would use that power. And I don't think I'd have any qualms or shame about it, but I can imagine if you have that kind of power all your life, you will start to feel insecure about people's real feelings for you. Like, does he love me because of me? Is he doing whatever he's doing for me because he wants to make me happy, or is he just under my power? I don't know. As a married woman, I feel like, do I care? As long as it gets done, right? I don't have a single friend who doesn't have a honey-do list the mile long, and their husbands are not moving this list forward, right? So I don't know that I really care, but I think it's an interesting dynamic. And I think we could have been shown that dynamic rather than just told that this is what's going on. And so I think that just brings me back to what's been bothering me about a lot of the books I've been reading lately, these new releases, these YA fantasies. I've read quite a few more than I've even talked about on the podcast. Because at a certain point, I feel like I'll just be saying the same thing over and over again, is that they lack depth. They lack depth, and they do not feel character driven. They feel like they're being driven by tropes. I want to do an enemies to lovers, or I want to do something, I want to do a siren. It just feels like they're being driven by what the characters want to do, what they want to put in the books, rather than emerging from the characters. I reviewed the first two books of Natasha Bowen's series, Skin of the Deep, and I think the second one, Skin of the Deep and Soul of the Deep. I think Soul of the Deep is the second one. And in the back of both of those books, she has a little author's message where she talks about her inspiration and some of the things she wanted to include, and how she wanted to really showcase African mythologies and lores and the African versions of these kinds of creatures and settings that we often associate with fantasy and with Western fantasy. So, oh, I wanted to show these African fairies and dragons and mermaids and these deities, and but I also wanted to show this happening at the time of the slave trade, right? And I think this is great. I think it's amazing. But I think a dynamic that happens if you are writing from the perspective of wanting to include certain things, then are you writing from the perspective of character? Are you writing from the character out so that the character's desires and the conflicts between the major characters is what's actually pushing the story forward, and not kind of, okay, here's where I'm going to put this, here's where I'm going to put that. And that's the thing that I'm feeling about a lot of these books, is that the authors are wanting to, okay, this is where I'm going to do this is where I'm going to do that, instead of writing from character out and the conflict that arises when characters want things and those things are in conflict with each other. Oh, another thing I didn't like about this sequel, this kind of plot line with Saoirse and this person who betrayed her in the first book, and them having to work together and kind of reconciling, and then that kind of redemption arc, friendship story. I do love that we had a platonic friendship story that is so key and integral to the book. One of the things I've mentioned is that I want to see other kinds of relationships between romantic relationships centered in fantasy. So I do like that. I do feel like the closeness and the intimacy and the importance of this person and this relationship was a little bit retconned to be more significant than it really appeared to me in the first book, right? So I feel like I would have needed to see a more depth and intimacy and importance of that relationship established earlier so that both the betrayal hits harder and the redemption arc feels more important and significant and believable, that this person is so important to you that you will forgive them for some unforgivable shit, because the shit is unforgivable that she's being called to forgive this person for. So that's one thing. Another thing is I feel like the reconciliation and the redemption only become possible because this character that Saoirse is having to forgive, be on this journey with, is completely evacuated of the goals and the desires that made him betray her in the first book, right? So I don't get it. I don't know when was the point when this person stopped caring about this thing that was so important to you that they betrayed you in this terrible way and caused this incredible pain and harm. To me, it makes the reconciliation possible, but it also undermines the relationship because it's like, if this wasn't that important, why did you do that shit to me? This critique is probably just really, really hard to understand if you did not read the first book. So I'll leave that there. But yeah, that's one of the problems. I'm feeling like these books are not character driven and they are too tropey. One of the things I've noticed in every YA fantasy that I've read this year is that there are like certain scenes or moments that it seems like they want to have happen. And I think that those expectations are shaped by by like fantasy films. So the Cinderella moment. The Cinderella moment has happened in every single YA fantasy I have read this year, and that is that there's some kind of event or ball or party or something that is like central to the plot that serves as kind of a countdown to the plot. And there's a moment where the young woman protagonist enters this event in a beautiful gown. And there are places and times where this is really appropriate. Like, I'm actually looking for a book I read that is a Cinderella. Cinderella is Dead. That's another book I read maybe last year. I haven't talked about it on the podcast. I just didn't get a chance to. But like a Cinderella moment in a book called Cinderella's Dead, it's appropriate, right? Like I think this is kind of a horror book. Maybe I'll stick this on my Blackoween Rita TBR. But this is a book about this kingdom that where the idea of Cinderella, the story of Cinderella and her prince has become kind of a theology or religion for the kingdom and is used to subjugate the girls and the women in the kingdom. And so there is this ball where they are matched with suitors with husbands, and the girls who don't get husbands after 3 years, like I don't remember what happens to them. I read this book last year, but I think they like die. I don't know. I have to brush up, but something terrible happens to you if you don't get a husband. So, of course, there's a ball, right? And she comes in it's a beautiful, beautiful gown, of course. But some of these Cinderella moments in these books don't make sense. Hayes' birthday party being this major kind of plot point of the first book just felt forced, right? It felt forced to give her a Cinderella moment, Saoirse a Cinderella moment that made no sense because she's supposed to be his bodyguard. If she is attending the ball as his bodyguard, why is she wearing this beautiful gown? that she's going to trip over if she has to actually fight. And why are they dancing together? She's supposed to be watching his back. While you're dancing with him, he could get shot in the back with an arrow. It just didn't make any sense. And it's just moments like this just pull me out of a book because then I become hyper aware of the author and what the author is trying to do. Oh, you're trying to give us a Cinderella moment here. Like the moment in the film where the protagonist enters in this like gorgeous dress that people are going to talk about in their video essays, right? So I'm like, write from your characters, write from your characters, write from your characters. Maybe this sounds harsh. One of the reasons I really haven't been reviewing books on this podcast is because I know that once I start getting picky, it's going to be picky. Once I took the gloves off that people were going to see some of my real self in terms of how I critique works of art, and I kind of didn't want to do that when it comes to Black Mermaid books because I have hopes of being in community with a lot of these authors. I have met some of these authors. I have done reviews, written reviews that the authors have actually have a chance of coming across and reading. So I've been conflicted about how truthfully I wanted to talk about the books, but it is what it is, y'all. Let's work on our craft. You have just listened to the Merwomanist podcast with Mommy Melusine. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, review, I would love 5 stars, and subscribe for future episodes. You can follow me on Instagram at mommy, that's MAMI, _ Melusine, or at Merwomanist Podcast, on LinkedIn at Jalandra Davis, or my website, jalandradavis.com. Wishing you love and laughter and hoping to see you swim this way again.